Dear listeners, a warning that this episode contains a graphic description of a criminal act. Tired workers are deadly weapons. Episode 8, Tragic Road Rage Story. We delve into the complexity of fatigue, shift work, and high performance versus just merely coping. For overproductive workers, we look at burnout. Fatigue can seem invisible, so how do we imagine the symptoms when we work anywhere? Ultimately, we ask, are we designing for what we want or what we do not want? Hello and welcome to the Why Work podcast series. You are listening to Trace Vitkovsky, Sarah Bazell and Alan Girl. Fatigue. Just getting tired thinking of the concept. I want to talk about fatigue. Everybody's talking about fatigue, and so they should. And I think the conversation with respect to fatigue should be continuing. I read a case which is completely unrelated to work, but it is. So it's a criminal matter. It's a matter of the Queen against Hecky. It's actually relating to one punch. Now, when we think of one punch, we think of alcohol-fueled violence, young adolescents, rat bags, perhaps hanging around the Valley Mall, full of booze, and then for no reason, no rhyme, one punched someone and has caused the death of that person. So I found a really interesting snippet in one of these so-called one-punch cases, and it's got me thinking about fatigue. I'll tell you quickly about this case, and then I want to hear your thoughts about it. So it was a one-punch, but this is what happened. The applicant awoke at 1:30 a.m. and left home at 2 a.m. in order to commence his working day at Murarrie at 3 a.m. The applicant was employed in a warehouse lifting dry goods and worked his 12-hour shift with only an hour off for lunch, completing his work at 3 p.m. Then the applicant drove home on the Gateway motorway. They were dovetailing each other. This is with the victim. The applicant pulled over. Both cars pulled over on the side and an altercation occurred. There was essentially a blow delivered to the applicant's, to Mr. American's head, I should say, and Mr. American fell backwards on the roadway, and within a second or two, he was hit by a truck. So road rage has occurred. This is not a case involving a young alcohol-fueled violent altercation, but simply two family men. They both had children. So we're not dealing with adolescents, as you say, but rather they've had a serious altercation on the side of the road, and as a result of the one punch, a fatality has resulted. Now, it's interesting, the sentencing judge's remarks, and this is why I'm talking about this today. His Honour said this: the fact that you were not affected by alcohol, but fatigued after a long day at work and agitated by the encounter distinguishes your case from a case of alcohol-fueled violence like in Renata. So I picked that up to bring it to the table today, the fact that the court used the word fatigue and a long day shift. So I want to ask you, this is highly speculative. Do you think to some extent doing such long shifts could alter a person's state so much that they are just not in a good place?
I think there's more than that. We're forced to recognise now that working long hours is a psychosocial issue. And by definition, being a psychosocial issue, it could cause psychological problems. But even before we were talking about psychosocial issues, fatigue has been a problem forever. Whether it's people driving on the road or whether it's other things, tired workers make mistakes, and when they make mistakes, people get hurt.
It's significant, Trace. This is a lot to unpack because you're talking about road rage, needing to be in control, having an aggressive episode, and underpinning this, some element of fatigue here. And fatigue, if you're looking at cumulative fatigue, we know that erodes generosity, benevolence is diminished. So even these aspects of how we contribute to social constructs, health and well-being, when people are overloaded and don't have that rest and recovery, their generosity just dissipates, right? So even just the how nice you are and how much you want to give to others shuts down. When you're fatigued, you can have these acute episodes as well as Alan was mentioning about aggression, rage, incivility, right through to violence, right? These behavioral episodes. And fatigue is not just the shifts that you work, which I understand that was mentioned, but what's the nature of the work that you're doing? What are the interpersonal relationships? Are there significant physical demands that fatigue you physically and emotionally? Is there a situation where you have a lot of conflict or a lot of interruptions and there's cognitive overload? Is it cognitive underload where you're under-challenged and then you take risk-taking behaviors, or you're simply lost in your attention? So you've got this huge aspect to unpack and consider the employer's responsibility for creating this profile of a worker who's ready to ignite.
Yeah, tinderbox.
Tinderbox.
Spark. So you've just mentioned quite a few things there about just what fatigue does to a person. So it's a broad spectrum. Do you think this is a systemic issue in the way in which we work, or do you think employers have got a handle on fatigue? Do they understand it?
Well, fatigue's difficult to understand, is an area of expertise in itself, but I think any workplace where there's extended working hours or long working hours, fatigue's potentially an issue.
And complex work, or work where the nature of the work can be emotionally demanding and taxing.
He says often people talk about exhaustion. Are they referring to the same thing? Fatigue, exhaustion?
No, they're different, although related. So when we're talking about fatigue, we're talking about the inability to perform a task. Whether it's driving, or whether it's operating machinery, or whether it's just coping with the emotional stresses of a work environment.
And exhaustion starts to approach burnout. Exhaustion starts to approach cumulative buildup, eroding our threshold tolerances for small events that normally we would cope with quite well. It reduces our resilience, our ability to be adaptive and agile and regenerate in good ways, learn, reflect, be generous, all those kinds of things. So burnout, where we just hate the universe at some point or hate ourselves, and we can have other symptoms of a mental health disorder like depression.
So fatigue, perhaps exhaustion, is the consequence burnout? Is this the final?
Over time without restoration, there's certainly a risk for that. So you need to understand the contributing factors, and if there's not enough rest and recovery, what's happening here to lead us to that point.
You're often asked by an insurer, would you like burnout insurance? I say to them sometimes, what, for me? They go, no, for your washing machine. So I see this term burnout as this, but does anybody really know what burnout?
Well, burnout means a complete mental, physical and emotional exhaustion.
Can you come back from it though? And I guess that would lead into design opportunities. Like if you can't restore and you're burnt out, can you recover from a burnout? You can't recover a burnt-out motor. Do people recover from a burnout?
Psychologists would support the fact that if you have the right interventions, you're talking about a whole neurological regulation that's required. Restoration, regulation, reframing, taking a whole inventory of what's part of those contributing factors. But yes,
it would go back to, it'd have to go back to then, as you said before, creating awareness and prevention, and having to, this is no different to what we talked about earlier about addressing, whether or not a person's okay working from home. Who's monitoring the fatigue? Who's keeping an eye on these things?
So
at home?
You're talking about fatigue at home. Well, that's a big problem for employers because you can manage what's happening within the work hours at the workplace, but it's very difficult to manage what's happening at home. And you can give advice, you can give support, You can make resources available, but you can't stop a person doing what they want to do in their recreational hours at home.
Yeah, so again, that means to me, I'm thinking of an overly productive worker, an overzealous worker, somebody just who can't switch off.
Well, you can have problems where you have a worker turn up in the morning at work and they clearly haven't slept all night. And how do you manage that situation?
Well, it's interesting that you say that because we spoke earlier about lawyers who have this high commitment. They might be engaged, but perhaps over-engaged, if you use that term, so that they're so committed that they, work in prolonged hours in ways that push themselves and that interrupt their involvement with other activities that would otherwise balance them, right? So it's this fine line of having the just right degree of engagement at work, where you actually still take pleasure in taking a break from work too.
But how do you control the overly invested worker? So we can measure fatigue in how many things you put on the conveyor belt and you can measure it in terms of time. How are you keeping an eye on that very productive worker? That's got to be tough.
Or the worker who's just been exposed to feeling obligated to performing, doing the long hours, or being subject to very confronting type of work or physically exhausting work, right?
Yeah, that would exhaust. Yeah, mentally exhaust. If you're exposed to those images, getting back to Kazarov's case, where just that constant viewing, law enforcement would be the same.
The situation where law enforcement, that's right, the situation where you're short-staffed, you're trying to help your workmates out. Maybe you're in that case where you're a frontline worker and you haven't had the option to work from home that we've talked about too. You're the first call respondent. You're the healthcare worker who's, right there in the midst of the crisis and being called back to work for extra overtime.
So actually exposure to the level of intensity of work in itself could be a causative effect of fatigue. So in other words, you may only be working for a short period of time, but your ability to process.
Too often I see employers trying to address fatigue management through industrial relations strategies by simply talking about work shifts.
That's right.
And that's why I'm always careful to point out, hang on, this is not just an industrial relations workforce strategy issue. This is health, well-being, safety, risk management, that whole continuum. There needs to be separate policies around this to recognize not just work hours and breaks that are adhered to, but the nature of the work and the ongoing investigations about people's health and well-being, because threshold tolerances will vary among individuals.
And that's the point I guess I wanted to tease out was, so whilst we mentioned that previous case, he'd worked his 12 hours with the lunch break, so they're measuring that in terms of time, they can chronologically sequence all that. What you're suggesting is, what are these workers doing? And that level of intensity, that is really what the design space is about, isn't it?
And I go back to saying, are we designing for what we want or just what we don't want? So if we're designing for what we want, yes, you want inspired workers and you want revitalized workers, and they may temporarily go out of balance for traditional measures of heart rate and sleep cycles if they're working in something they absolutely love and it's related to their higher aspirations, but then you have adequate rest and recovery to recharge that person.
Yeah, that's a really good way of looking at fatigue, because you're right, we're looking at fatigue in a linear way. Oh, you're working back-to-back 12 hours or you're driving long haul from here to here. That's just one-dimensional. You're suggesting something different, something multidimensional.
Absolutely.
Fatigue.
It's a system. Neurological system, you've got systems in the body. I always go back to basic biological, psychosocial, cognitive factors and then look at the macro for the organization. If you don't give the muscles enough adequate recovery, cumulatively you're likely to have an injury if there's too much repetition, if there's too much exposure over time, right? If you have an acute, significant incident, you can also have an injury, but it's just immediately exceeded your threshold tolerances. Some sort of hypertrophy we talked about earlier, muscle growth, you've got atrophy, muscle diminishing. Similarly, cognitive, psychosocially, emotionally, nerves that synapse the way you think, the decisions that you can make diminish. Something too severe, too acute, too obnoxious, something slow, insidious over time without recovery.
What about doctors in emergency wards where they've got that long hours but also the intensity
and
of what
crisis.
they're doing?
Triple whammy. That's right. All combined. And a system that is, I use the term unregulated, meaning it has a constant state of flux. It's constantly in a state of unpredictable situations where you have to constantly adjust what you might have otherwise expected would be there. The workload, you don't know what's coming when an ambulance is ramped, right? So you're always in a situation of having to negotiate what's a priority. That's exhausting.
So on that, I guess, do you think the armed services are all over this? Because I'm immediately thinking about what the ADF, what those who sign up would have to.
Think about veterans and mental health disorders right there.
So you go, this fatigue is...
Trauma, unpredictability, away from home, long hours.
But always being on alert. So those who are writing these codes and policies and standards, you might be if you're looking at fatigue at a broader context. That's the elephant in the room, isn't it?
The assumption that people can accommodate it because they've been doing it for a while, as though that should be easily adjusted.
They get used to it.
They get used to it. That's right. They get used to it, not understanding that this can lead to exhaustion and burnout. Our resources that are available diminish over time. It's comfortable to revert to behavioral-based strategies to say, you need to make sure that you're sleeping better, you need to make sure your nutrition is good, you need to make sure your hydration is good. Yes, those are important, helpful education aspects, but what's the system of work? What's contributing to this in the design of work?
We hope you enjoyed that episode of Why Work. You've been listening to Trage, Sarah and Alan, and if you'd like to know more about some of the things we've talked about today, please subscribe and we'd be more than happy to provide you with information, names of cases, other things that may interest you. Please be aware that none of the matters we've talked about today should be construed as legal advice or any other type of advice. We're just here to talk about all things related to work. See you next time.